Namaste and greetings. I, GBAT, researcher and assistant editor at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evang NITI Anusandan Sansthan, Nayi Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. In light of yesterday's budget presentation, we are gathered today for a special panel discussion on the pandemic era and Union Budget 2022-23 as a part of the State of Public Finance to #Towards Accountability series. This event is organized by the Center for the Study of Finance and Economics, IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi. Now, let me take this moment to introduce the gathering. As the chair of today's discussion, we are privileged to have with us Dr. Dhiraj Nayyar. He is the Director of Economics and Policy, Vedanta, and the former OSD and Head of Economics, Finance and Trade, NITI Aayog. We welcome you, sir. As our esteemed panelists, we have with us Ms. Nalini Gulati. She is the Managing Editor of Ideas for India and the Country Economist, India Program International Growth Center. We feel honored to have you with us, ma'am. Welcome to the session. We are delighted to have with us Mr. Saugata Bhattacharya. He is the Executive Vice President and the Chief Economist of Axis Bank. We welcome you, sir. We are pleased to be joined by Mr. Subhomoy Bhattacharjee, who is the Consulting Editor of Business Standard and also a consultant at Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS. We welcome you, sir. We also have with us Dr. Pooja Misra. She is the Associate Professor and Chairperson of Economics, Birla Institute of Management Technology. We are honored to have you with us, ma'am. Welcome to the session. Now, I invite our chair, Dr. Dhiraj Nayyar, to initiate the discussion with his opening remarks. We look forward to learning from our esteemed gathering. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So we had the Union Budget presented yesterday. The Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman's fourth budget speech, and it's always good to talk about the budget the day after. I mean, we've all given our comments yesterday as well at various forums, but I think yesterday and on the day of the budget, one tends to comment much more based on the budget speech, without a full study of the budget document, because I think it's the speech doesn't talk about everything, particularly state of public finance in the when you go deeper down in terms of which sectors, which schemes, what the allocation is for next year, what the actual was for the previous year, what the RE is for this year. So I think it gives us the 24 hours, gives all of us a little more time. So I think that's in that sense, we are gathered at a good moment to discuss the budget. In terms of, in my view, I always believe that we have to judge a budget given the economic scenario and the context, and I think we are all well aware, and this webinar itself puts the pandemic right up front in its title, and we are now hopefully coming out of the worst of the health side of the pandemic, hopefully with the vaccinations having gone well in India, and Omicron, the latest variant, proving not to be so lethal. We can only say may, because we never know with the new virus how it'll go. But we may be now looking at the tail end of what has been a very difficult 2 years. And the fact is that in terms of many of our indicators, in terms of our GDP, we are roughly where we were, or a little better than where we were 2 years ago. So in that sense, it's a lost 2 years. And I think, again, in the context of an emerging economy like India, in a country where a lot of people are just above the poverty line, or just entering the middle class, the kind of shock that a pandemic like COVID gives us is quite serious in terms of living standards and quality of life. So I think all of those things are there, and we've had last year and the year before we've had number of what you could say mini budgets as COVID went along, and as it unfolded, various measures were announced and taken. But this, I would hope, is the first post-COVID budget. And I think we are clearly, if you look at the macro scenario, looking at a scenario of recovering growth. Obviously, it's on a low base, but nonetheless, it's recovering. And now the challenge is to sustain it, if not at 9% plus level, at least at 7% plus level for the next several years. That's very crucial, because ultimately growth is what's going to increase the size of the economy, and that is really, in my view, the priority for the country. But I mean, the lurking macroeconomic challenge is inflation. Again, I'm not sure it's because of excess demand, or I don't think it's because of excess demand or domestic factors, but there's a certain commodity inflation because of the loose monetary policies globally. Oil prices are spiking right now. There's every possibility they may go up to $100 a barrel. So that will itself put pressure on inflation, already evident across the world, but that's a factor as well, and that would have weighed on the FM and her team. How do you balance the growth and inflation scenario at this point? I think the choice that the government finally opted for overall was classic Keynesian government stimulus, because if you look at the economy as it is, consumption is still dampened. Investment cycle has not really revived. In fact, the investment cycle was doing poorly even before COVID struck. Exports have done well, but then imports are also high, so net exports are not adding to GDP. So the only engine which can really add to GDP at this point and drive GDP is government spending, and therefore you see this 35% increase in capital expenditure, which is expected to drive growth and crowd in private investment. That said, I always want that government spending as a proportion of GDP is 14-15%. It's a small number. So until consumption, which is 55% plus, almost 60%, investment, which is 30%, needs to go up to about 35%. So unless consumption, investment, exports all fire, sustainable growth is not possible. So government can invest, be a temporary palliative measure, or a catalyst measure to bring growth. So I think in that sense, the right thing has been done. I also welcome the fact that though there are 5 assembly elections, including crucial state of Uttar Pradesh coming up next month, there was no new announcement or new populist scheme. The government has been restrained, which is compliments to them. Naturally, the fiscal deficit is high at 6.9, but again, I think you have to look at the context, the pandemic context. So I think given that, a further fiscal squeeze was not really feasible at this point in time. So I think overall, if you look at it in terms of the macroeconomics, it seems to be a budget made for the times, conservative on the conservative side, not populist, not radical, but based on kind of sound economics for the times. As I said, you can't say a fiscal deficit of 3% is ideal in a time of pandemic. So I think that's where we are overall. But then there are various things, and I'll stop my opening remarks here. I don't want to. I'll make some more affirmative, definitive remarks towards the end, because I don't want to, preempt what our panelists are going to say. But there are various things, which have been talked about and discussed in the 24 hours since. Of course, in terms of whether agriculture has got enough, whether education, health have got enough, particularly health, given that we're in a pandemic. Whether more could have been done on in terms of a safety net, whether they could have been tax relief, and which could have given a consumption boost. So there are various questions, and obviously, when we have 4 economists on the panel, I'm sure we'll get at least 4 different views, if not more than that. And I look forward to hearing what everyone has to say. And then, of course, we will also be taking questions from the audience. So without saying anything further, I'd invite Saugata Bhattacharya, Chief Economist of Axis Bank, to give his initial views for about 10 minutes on what he thinks of the budget and its response to the macroeconomic situation that we find ourselves in. Saugata, you're on mute. You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Thank you, Dhiraj. Thank you, IMPRI, Dr. Arjun Kumar, for this opportunity of interacting with all of you. Big privilege. So let me start, as Dhiraj has already done a very masterful job of the macro environment, but let me add a couple more perspectives, one from the global side. One, India is definitely likely to, and Dhiraj, I'm not going to take the entire 10 minutes, maybe 6-7 minutes India's external financial conditions are definitely going to be much, much tighter than we had in the last couple of years. The Federal Reserve in particular, the US Federal Reserve, has indicated a very, very aggressive tightening of their monetary policy. The US labor markets are very tight. Inflation is at historic highs. So they are going to start in March. They have already started on their tapering program. They are going to start hiking rates in March aggressively. It's going to be very tough. Other than the US Fed, many of the other G10 central banks are also likely to start increasing their rates. The European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan are likely to start much later. But I mean, the overall financial conditions are likely to be very tough. Secondly, there's the factor of China. So China has slowed down. You've seen the recently, just a week or so back, the IMF has come out with its update on the World Economic Assessment. So global growth is slated to slow down, partly because of the policy tightening measures, monetary policy tightening measures. And China is slowing down because, I mean, inherently, I mean, China is actually moving the other way around. I mean, it's begun to give a stimulus program in its side. So that's going to be a problem. The IMF forecast that the world economic growth is going to come down from 5.9% to 4.4%. Trade is going to slow down. As Dhiraj mentioned, one of the key engines of growth last year, not from a GDP perspective, but from a value-added perspective, was exports. We are probably going to get about the target of $400 billion, a record for us. So that is likely to slow down. Both the WTO actually forecasts a much more aggressive slowdown over a period of time. So the export engine is probably not going to be as important in our growth environment. So it has to be more domestic driven. Secondly, in terms of the growth inflation trade-off, I think so. One of the things is it is more favorable now than it was last year. So our own forecast of global growth, of domestic growth, India's growth is about 8.3% for next year, 9.2%. I think there's a downside risk. We'll probably grow at 9% for this year and then carry on into about a 8.3% growth, which is what the economic survey also indicates, an 8 to 8.5% growth, real growth for the system. With CPI inflation, our average forecast this time is about 5.3. That is likely to slowly, bumpily over the next year, FY23, begin to come down, averaging about 4.5, but 4.8. But there are upside risks. As Dhiraj mentioned, oil has become a huge problem because of the current oil increase, prices of crude oil increase is driven largely by geopolitical concerns. But underlying this, IEA forecasts indicate that the overall supply-demand balance, demand is going to be higher in 2022, calendar 22, compared to the pre-pandemic levels. And there haven't been any investments in oil. US shale is not coming back. So oil is likely to be very tough, and oil does play a very key role in India's inflation trajectory. So that part is, there are upside risks. If we are lucky, because of the Chinese slowdown, the metals complex might actually come down a little bit. So, I mean, from the metal side, commodity side, it's likely to be a little big. But, I mean, the chip shortages, etc., chip shortages, the lead times have again gone up in December. Freight rates have come down, but, I mean, waiting times at ports, etc., from that entire logistics part, that still is likely to contribute to inflation. The good thing is that last year, as Dhiraj mentioned, in real terms, what we expect in the end of FY23 22, March 22, the FY23, I mean, the real GDP levels would be about the same levels as the pre-pandemic at FY20. But in terms of nominal growth, that's a very important part. We are about 30 to 32 trillion rupees, that is to say 32 lakh crore rupees higher than the pre-pandemic levels. The distribution of this has unfortunately become very skewed. So this 30 lakh additional incomes that we have got over the last couple of years is very, very likely, and there is increasing evidence to support what I'm saying, that this is going towards the top quintile or the top 3 deciles of the income earning class. So, I mean, the distribution has become very, very skewed. We have seen recent surveys which indicate that the PLFS surveys, labor surveys also support this. So that is a major problem that going forward. Growth is not going to be that big a problem in the next couple of years. We are going to coming in largely from the consumption and production related aspects of the top income deciles. So that is going to sustain. But on the other side, the lower side, the aggregate demand, how durable that growth is likely to be is a question. And remember, as of now, I'm just going to stop now. As of now, it does seem that there is a major distribution. Our focus as the budget, which is one of the good things of the budget, it is focused more on the medium term. But what is India's potential growth? How can the budget actually take potential growth up so that the capex multipliers begin to work and go down the system via the MSME chain into a more broad-based consumption and aggregate demand is something which is very, very critical at that point in time and requires support. Finally, one last 10 more seconds. Last 2 years, fiscal and monetary policy had worked in tandem, in coordination with each other, in trying to support the revival phase of the economic growth. Now they will have to go on their own separate paths, given what I just said about about rising interest rates, rising inflation, the global central bank actions. So the role of monetary policy in this environment mostly is to provide stable market conditions. The financial market stability is the role of monetary policy on the stimulus side, and particularly from a medium-term potential growth aspect. The focus is on the fiscal side, both center and we don't mention this often enough, on the state's risk. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I've taken up more time than I thought. Sorry.
Thanks a lot, Saugata, for those initial remarks. We'll come back to you a little later on with some questions and some further remarks. Dr. Pooja Misra, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Dhiraj. I'll do a macroeconomic overview kind of a thing. Let me just share my presentation. Okay, so you can view my presentation, right? Am I right on that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, yes. So where I wanted to start from is what are the current numbers that are there, and economic survey, while that has also mentioned it, but I'm now going to go back and talk about numbers, November, December related numbers, January related numbers. So as far as the high frequency macroeconomic indicators are concerned, we've already read that GST, e-way bills, power demand, etc. is on a rise. So the economy is pretty upbeat about it. Now, GST in January was at its peak. PMI for services, manufacturing, these are December numbers. So while it was at 55.5, November it was better. No guesses around it. December it came down because of the Omicron virus, the impact of the Omicron virus. IIP growth is also steadying out. On our balance of payment side, so current account deficit, while earlier it was in a surplus of 0.9%, that's become a deficit of minus 1.3%. Not too much to worry on that. Reason being because the imports that are there, they are more capital intensive in nature. And like we're all aware, capital intensive imports is beneficial for the economy. India has transformed itself from being one of the fragile 5 countries, and it has one of the largest forex reserves. Interestingly, over here, tax revenue, indirect direct tax revenue has been higher than budgetary estimates, and the government is obviously betting on that. Google Mobility Index, when I talk of that, again, January numbers, while they're showing a minus 36% for workplaces, minus 2%, but this is all the Omicron effect. CPI inflation, like Saugata mentioned, so CPI inflation was about at 5.6%. WPI inflation was 13.56%. Here, the only little worry is that what if we are able to bring down CPI, that's fantastic. But what if WPI numbers start moving into CPI? And as far as inflation is concerned, I also wanted to add, if you remember, the economic survey mentions imported inflation. That could be a major, major problem for India, and RBI needs to watch out for that. Like we've been all reading, consumption is a problem. Consumer confidence index has been at a very pessimistic, has been extremely pessimistic low, and that's why people were hoping for some kind of benefits on the tax front, direct tax front, etc. They were trying to negotiate for it. Capacity utilization. So on the investment side, on the producer side, capacity utilization is still at a low at 69.4. And obviously the government needed to do something about that. Way away from 76.9. Healthier numbers is, if we reach 80, it's fantastic, but I don't think India, we've ever been there. Another thing that is a little bit of a worry is the labor force participation rate. While we are close to pre-pandemic levels, but as far as India is concerned, labor force participation rate is still pretty low. And obviously employment needs to be generated and people need to get into the workforce. As far as the government is concerned, the picture that they had was, it was a fiscal tightrope walk for the government. They needed to balance between a near and short-term revival in consumption and a medium-term growth potential. What they opted out for is the medium-term growth potential. Banking system, during the COVID period, pretty well capitalized. NPAs are on a decline. That works positive for us. Corporate leverage has also improved. Contact intensive sectors. So when I'm talking of contact intensive sectors, and that's where the K-shaped recovery comes in, right? Hospitality, etc., is on the lower part of the K. Like Saugata mentioned, so Federal Reserve, that's already, that's going to be a major, major watch out for the RBI. As far as the government is concerned, so government opted for a growth-oriented budget along with fiscal consolidation. CapEx target, government has increased from 5.5 lakh crore to 7.5 lakh crore, and obviously everybody is applauding that because that is where the entire multiplier effect comes in. Now the catch over here is going to be, while government says that government consumption expenditure investment is going to crowd in the private investment, let's hope that's the way it moves. Implementation is key over here, right? Fiscal deficit, like even Dhiraj mentioned, so 6.9% in 21-22, bringing it down to 6.4%, and slowly the glide path moves towards 4.5%. Now, the interesting part is the technology push, where the government has been riding on this digital, they're hoping to ride on the digital technology front. We're already aware crypto is going to, so crypto, which was so much in discussion, there's at least clarity around that it's going to be taxed at 30%. Blockchain, the central bank digital currency, that's going to be effective launched by RBI April 1st. 5G mobile services. And if we go back and we are able to launch this is going to again, help boost the economy. And there's already planning for a PLI scheme. The plan on promoting audio visual gaming sector, that's interesting. Reason being because one, you'll be able to provide employment and provide employment to the youth, where their interest lies. Interestingly, agriculture. So while they've repealed all the farm laws, the 3 farm laws, but there are enablers for agriculture, and hopefully that's going to set the base for the farmers, where they're talking in terms of delivery of high-tech digital services, impetus to agri-tech setups. Kisan drones, pretty interesting. If we are able to mobilize that, at least that's going to give a lot of benefit to our farmers. Now, this is where the cities part come in, because obviously we have a lot of disguised unemployment in agriculture. So if we are able to go ahead and nurture mega cities, hinterland, make them centers of economic activity, the anticipation anyway is that, and what obviously the government is hoping for is people who are a part of the disguised unemployment move towards the cities. However, we also need sustainability as far as the metros, etc., is concerned, right? As far as their infrastructure is concerned. And that is where the government will come back and wants to work on that in the next 10, 15 years. Obviously, all of this is going to give a boost to real estate, construction, steel, cement. These are all core sectors which will get a boost. Disinvestment, that was something that was welcome. While they set a target even in the last financial year, 1,75,000 crore, they're nowhere near it. Next year, the target is a little more realistic, 65,000 crore. If you notice, the budget talks in terms of SEC legislation getting a makeover, right? And if the government is able to go back and use all the infrastructure that they have, the plug and play, etc., infrastructure, because of the good, well connectivity, if they're going to be able to use it even for domestic production over here, So as of now, the SECs are only meant for the export market. But if we can go back and use it even for our domestic market, that's also going to, at the end of the day, help the economy, because obviously you're ensuring that you're supplying more of goods even in your domestic economy. And you are going back and utilizing all this infrastructure that you have optimally, right? MSMEs, I think one of the big five, so amongst the five main sectors that have profited, even MSME. So MSME, again, there's an emergency credit line scheme. Interestingly, the numbers that came, 66% of the sanctioned amount last year was given to the MSMEs, and that will continue till March 23. So that is a big positive. 50,000 crores earmarked for hospitality sector. That's where the hospitality sector is on the lower part of the case. So it's going to fuel that up. One point that I wanted to go back and talk about is Bankruptcy Code. While they've talked of seamless cross-border insolvency, they also need to bring back the Bankruptcy Code. So if you remember, when COVID hit, Bankruptcy Code was put in the back burner. This needs to come back. One, obviously, importantly, they need to go back and bring down the months in which the resolution happens, right? And second, most importantly, what they need to do is quicker dispute resolution has to take place. As far as tax side is concerned, so while everybody was hoping that there's going to be some benefit in terms of direct taxes, that's not where it really came out. So yes, the 2 years extension that will be given for anybody who wants to go back and update payment of taxes is going to help reduce litigation. Okay, a little bit on the rural side, 2.37 lakh crore, the money that's been kept aside for MSP. The important part is that it's going to get directly credited into the farmer's account, right? So that is there with the farmer for consumption. And here is where where we wanted that consumption push that will come in from. As far as skills are concerned, National Skill Qualification Framework, that's going to help align the skills that are there along with what the industry needs. So all the time we get to hear that the graduates who are passing out really might not be in line with what the requirements of the industry is, and this is where the help is going to come from. Before I end, so okay, another just 1 or 2 more slides. The important part is, while the government is talking of this entire capex push, implementation, execution is key. Right, we've heard of National Asset Monetization Plan, we've heard of National Infrastructure Pipeline, etc. But now government needs to get onto the ground and start implementing them. So this is, if we manage that, then yes, all the positives that we are hearing of the budget, that's going to come into effect. And a step in the right direction is the National Land Monetization Corporation, which I think 2 days prior to the budget, we heard that it was incorporated. Like Dhiraj mentioned, not a populist budget. So yes, marks to be given to the government on that. The reason why I say that is, for any government, when there are elections around the corner, they prefer to go for all populist measures. Hopefully it shows maturity on part of the government, where they're looking at more long-term and medium-term measures than instant rewards, right? Focused, so overall, as far as the budget is concerned, it's focused more on capital expenditure. And I'm sure all of us are aware that as far as capital expenditure is concerned, the multiplier works anything between 2.5, 2.6. And if I take it to a 6-7 year scenario, till about a 4.5. While revenue expenditure only transpires into a multiplier of about, the numbers go as 0.5 to something around 0.99, right? So the focus being on capital expenditure is good for the country. This is the last slide that I have, way forward. So while we'll also get some time towards the end to talk about it.
Can I ask you to save the way forward for the,
yeah, sure. Okay, yeah, we'll do that. Okay.
So thank you so much, Pooja. That was with thorough overview of what the budget did. Subhomoy, are you there? Would you like to? I don't. Subhomoy, you're on mute, and yeah, you're there now. You have to get off mute.
Yeah.
So
no, I was. It's much more fun listening to you, Saugata, Dhiraj Misra. It's much more. I mean, that way you get to learn much more. First of all, I agree with whatever you're saying. I mean, there's absolutely nothing with which one can dispute, or so I wouldn't really be traveling down that path. I just want to bring in that that whether the government was right in taking this position that it has taken. As Dr. Misra pointed out, that essentially, despite the chance that we are now going to be in 16 state assemblies and one general election coming up in 24, the government has actually left, central government has taken out 1 year out of that, saying that for the next 1 year, we shall not be taking any populist measure. Also, I add with that what Saugata was saying, that essentially there's a lot of problem there at the lower end of the income brackets, the distress in the economy. So together, both the things together, whether this was a right call at that point. And that will be where lots of debate throughout this year will be going along. So I'll just leave. So that is a very major something that we have not been in this position before. India government budget has always been expansive, ambitious. I'm taking out last year's budget. That budget was also very conservative and very extremely well crafted, according to me. But India government budgets have been tended to essentially forget that there's an expenditure constraint. So essentially, you just put money out of one pocket and put it into another pocket and hope in hell that the tax receipts and the non-tax receipts will somehow bridge the gap. This was the fiscal arithmetic, and which was more the time most economists naturally used to have copious commentaries to write about how the fiscal math was all right. This morning, the fiscal, all the commentaries were exactly in the reverse direction. Oh my God, they're so conservative, which is why all the notes that came were so short. Dhiraj will bear me out and Saugata will bear me out that this is something that we have been seeing and reading for ages, of how people sort of tore apart the government numbers. This time there was nothing to tear apart. The government has simply not spent anything. Now, the risk is, that today Fitch has issued a commentary saying that India's outlook is negative and it thinks it will stay negative. It's saying that the capex plan will need to be worked on hard, and to see whether India will be able to come down to the Bloomberg estimate of 6.1% GDP fiscal deficit before it even thinks that the Indian papers could be picked up. That is the international commentary, that despite doing everything, India is still considered not a very great investment avenue at this point. The second part is the India government itself has taken a conservative position that we know we have the problem, so we shall not include, buy our way out of the problem by trying to get into the global bond indices. Now that was considered a big escape key this time. And why I'm saying this thing was that this two things was very important for the markets, because it was considered that since India rarely comes to this position as it has currently come, there was just one escape key that was available. Take it, use it, and bring in more money into the economy. the government has decided that no, we'll not get into that trap. We shall work a bit more on our finances to see whether we are really out of the mess of decades. I would say that all this thing taken together shows a level of courage that I, honestly speaking, have not seen in the finance ministry for I don't know how many decades. It's remarkable. And this is something that is worth thinking about carefully, that is this therefore a very dramatic phase change in India's economic management story? Because if we don't bring these aspects into view, then it does, while everyone, I mean, there's a lot of positive commentaries coming along, but it doesn't really understand that whether the government has actually said that I have the ability to be able to do the heavy lifting that I'm promising myself I shall be doing without any external succor. It's something on which I would like to hear more from Saugata, more from Dhiraj, more from Dr. Misra. That is this a fund worth taking, or is this a call worth taking, given that there are international crises? I mean, the national weather is definitely not the best of times to try it. But then I don't know whether it's the worst of times also, because given that you don't know how the next pandemic would look like, whether the global commodity hard cycle, which has supposedly entered for the next 10 years, whether it'll worsen, and so on. So that is something I'd really like to hear from you people. The only other point I would like to say is that the deliverables from the government are supposed to be for health, education, and agriculture. Of these three, none fall under the remit of the central government. Let me put it clearly. In all of these sectors, the actual work has to be done by the state governments. Building a school, populating it with students and teachers is not the work of the center. The center just gives the money. Ditto for health, ditto for agriculture. Which means that whatever the lower quartile of India, the 2 quartiles of India would need, are those which the central government just can't offer, no matter whatever it might try to pretend. This time it has not pretended, but it has pretended for many years. Now, this is a very major point. Are the budget, therefore, or should I say it this way, that is therefore the debate that should be happening should be around the state budgets or should be around the central government? I would think the debate should be around the state budgets. It's not surprising that the difference between the southern states and the northern states are expanding. The capacity, the implementation capacity is drastically differing, is differing even more. I mean, it's like every year it's becoming bigger. And I think that is where a lot of work now needs to be done. We need to now accept, if we are going to accept, that the central government from now will basically be sort of maintaining a good housekeeping accounting budget, which will be transparent. But all the work in terms of ameliorative schemes will have to be handled by the state governments. In fact, I think I mean, I would rather say that is what they should be doing, because that is what they've been saying that they should have the right to do. So it's their role now. In that context, the central government's big job will be to ensure that the center just ensures that the conditions are right for national level investments to occur. No hiccups in terms of policies of tax, which it has again been promised and has delivered. And no hiccups in terms of bringing in sudden regulatory changes, which still tends to occur sometimes. Like, for instance, the problem between on e-commerce that we are seeing, which it is not yet solved. So that is where I think it stands. So again, to recap, the role is there. I mean, I would say there's a huge phase change. And this phase change now means it is the state governments which now need to work. That is where the position is, I would say. Why do I say so? I just end with one small anecdote. Just days before the budget, the same agitation which happened around POSCO steel mines in Orissa has again flared up about the JSW steel mill in the same place. There is nothing that the center can do about it. It is the state which has to solve it. Do the states have the ability to do these things? Next door, Deora Pachami's coal mine in West Bengal will face the same problem. It's the state governments which will have to do. Down south, the Foxconn challenge was something that Tamil Nadu has to handle. So I leave and that's my first set of thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Subhomoy. Lots of food for thought, and we'll come back to some of that in the discussion. Nalini, would you like to?
Yes,
give you
is my screen visible?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks. It's really useful to have these macro perspectives, and especially since I'll come to this from particular aspects such as mainly gender, but some quick views on also job creation, welfare, social sector, and maybe there can be more on that in the discussion later. So Dr. Nayyar said that in the first 24 hours we tend to, it's mainly about the speech and all the media commentary later, but the gender budget somehow doesn't make the cut. So now we are safely in the post 24-hour zone. So we'll spend some time talking about it on this platform. The reason it's slightly disappointing that the gender budget allocation is not announced in the budget speech is because Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman was actually part of the commission that spearheaded gender responsive budgeting in India back in 2005. Once you get past that and you dig into the detailed budget documents and you do some math, it does exist. This is the gender budget allocation for this year, 1,71,000 crores INR. If you compare it simply to the budget estimate from the last financial year, you see an increase. But then if you look at the proportion that this is of the total expenditure, it's about 4.3% this year. It was 4.4% last year. RE was slightly higher than BE, but basically, and then you see this trend graph. This is from India spend last year. And the point being that it's always generally in this average level of 5%. So I would say, there's nothing very new going on here. Be that as it may, I think we'll all agree that what really matters is the actual spend. And in this regard, there was a positive development in the interim budget of the financial year 2019-20. The actual spend column was introduced in the gender budget statement. And if you look at the budget documents before that, it's not there until that point. So here are two examples that I picked up from this year's gender budget statement. The first is from part A of the statement, which are all women-centric schemes. There, 100% of the allocation is for women. Whereas part B on the other side, it's these are not necessarily women's schemes. They're not women's schemes. They are schemes where at least 30% of the allocation is for women. So you see that, especially picking a strong example like Ministry of Women and Child Development, this actuals is well populated. The latest figures are from 2020-21, but that is in line with the rest of the budget, right? I mean, this information comes with a lag of 2 years. With a lag of 1 year, what we know are revised estimates and not actuals. But if you look at the other side, which is the first department that was mentioned under part B, you see that the field, it's not populated. They're not saying zero, they just don't have any values in there. So I think the point I'm trying to make with these examples is that, there has been progress, but there is a need to institutionalize gender responsive budgeting at all levels of government, national, subnational, and across ministries and departments. Basically, we need to build capacity in government so that this sort of gender lens can be applied to the entire process, starting from planning, budgeting, to program design, finally implementation, monitoring and evaluation, expenditure tracking, benefit incidents, and so on. When gender responsive budgeting in India completed 15 years in the financial year 2019-20, Nirmala Sitharaman, in her speech that time, she had actually proposed the formation of a broad-based committee with government and private stakeholders to evaluate gender responsive budgeting and to suggest actions for moving forward. But I've not seen any major update in this regard in the public domain. One of the most interesting of budget documents is this thing called, there's a line-by-line account of where things are with each announcement of the previous year's budget, and there it says something vague about that this is being done or it's in progress. Okay. So beyond the gender budget statement per se, if we'll think about this more broadly, what did the speech have about women? I think it was only this one part that mentioned women prominently with these are quotes from the budget by saying things like, we need to recognize Nari Shakti as the harbinger of our bright future and women-led development during the Amrit Kal. But after saying this, the three main examples that the finance minister highlighted were these schemes, Mission Vatsalya, Mission Shakti, Saksham, Anganwadi, and Poshan 2.0. Mission Vatsalya, I've been trying to look this up. There's different descriptions in different places. I think it is something around child protection and welfare, but also support for COVID widows with pensions. Mission Shakti is about empowering self-help groups, so essentially making rural women more economically independent. This kind of support, it's been going on for years. This is probably just not new, but a recent name, I think past 1 or 2 years. And finally, Saksham, Anganwadi, and Poshan 2.0, it's very much in the spirit of integrated women and child health. So here I would like to note that in this budget, and maybe the last one, what has happened is a lot of the existing schemes have been brought under the umbrella of a scheme which has a new name. So for example, Saksham Anganwadi now includes not only Poshan, as it's mentioned here, but also the National Creche Scheme, the scheme for adolescent girls, and 1 or 2 others. So basically, it makes things a little obscure. Like one needs to spend more time looking at the fine print and comparing across years, because it may well be that there are actually cuts in some important programs like ICDS, or that the increases are not very meaningful in real terms. But I think this is just something, an exercise that will continue over the next few days. Maybe this is one thing that needs more than 24 hours as well. But on the whole, my sense is if you look at these 3 schemes, which were the FM's examples, there are no doubt important interventions in terms of welfare and social security, but cumulatively, I'm not sure they quite embody this concept of women-led development. Of course, there are other parts of the budget that are likely to benefit women, like Jal Jeevan Mission. I think there's been good progress, further boost to this program in this budget. And the burden of fetching water in rural areas, it's borne disproportionately by women. So anything that eases their domestic responsibilities will indirectly enable their participation in paid work outside the home. So this is all good. But on the whole, like these ambitious plans of economic recovery, long-term growth strategies, I think the lack of gender approach, while the evidence is showing that the adverse impacts of the pandemic were very much gendered, in terms of job losses and things like that. And even pre-pandemic, we know that India's female labor force participation rates are among the lowest in the world. This is something we should be concerned about, given that the emphasis that we place on the demographic dividend, women constitute 1/2 of that potentially. I think.
Ma'am, are you changing slides? We are not able to.
Oh, you can't. Do I have to share screen again if I change slide?
No, we can see only the first slide.
Okay. Maybe I'll stop sharing and share again.
Yeah,
on the second slide.
that will do. Yeah.
Okay.
Otherwise, you can carry on. Don't worry.
Right. Yeah. Actually, it's fine because it was only it's. Can you see now the second slide or no?
We can. Yes.
Okay, great. But now let's see what happens when I switch again soon. So yeah, just to close the gender part of my initial remarks by saying that we should remember, gender blind is not necessarily gender neutral, especially in a context where there are these pre-existing glaring gender disparities. Now on this like livelihoods, welfare, I felt like there could have been more explicit acknowledgement, at least in the economic survey, if not in the budget speech, of what is going on with income distribution and how there are these rising inequalities during the pandemic period. I suppose this is difficult to do politically. Perhaps the government felt it is, making up for it by the budget speech being very, jobs, jobs, jobs. However, most of this job creation, the way it is set out in the budget, it's expected to come from the big infra push. So we need to see how quickly this happens. And I would in the discussion, like to hear from Dr. Misra on the infrastructure specifically. Because my sense is there tend to be long gestation periods in this sector. Another concern is, this big allocation for roads. How much of this is going to be new work, or is this about paying for work that's already been, say, done by NHAI in recent years, in which case it may not create a lot of jobs. So, there is relatively less in this budget by way of direct, immediate support to vulnerable, both individuals and enterprises that have been hurting. Maybe they could have been more focused on pre-existing programs like National Livelihoods Mission. No one is talking about DDU, GKY anymore, which is about, training rural poor youth and placing them in salary jobs in urban areas. Because the thing about these existing schemes is the institutional arrangements are already in place. And if cash is pumped in, one can expect to see quicker results, impact on the ground, rather than new schemes, which then take time. I think basically all of this is coming from these assumptions that the survey and the budget makes, which is to say that, the pandemic and its adverse impact is behind us. And the announcements that have been made, they can spur economic growth quite quickly and create jobs fast. And if that happens, maybe we'll be fine. And maybe as talking of things taking time, like infrastructure gestation periods, those PLI schemes that were announced in the last budget, maybe now they will kick in terms of actually creating jobs on the ground. Finally, on some aspects of the social sector, in education, it was good to see that at least this learning loss was acknowledged in the budget speech, less so in the economic survey, because the official data is only going up to 2019-20. So I felt that didn't make for very interesting reading, because it was more focused on, the trends in enrollment and what happened with gender parity in that time period, which is kind of known by now. So if you want to see more, this is supposed to be the state of the economy between 2000, up to this past financial year, then you expected this thing about COVID impacts to be front and center. So, but then the finance minister did mention it, and relatedly, there were these announcements of things like supplementary teaching, and acknowledging that a lot of the dissemination channels for digital learning are not inclusive, and focusing on then things like TV channels and regional languages. On health, there were some progressive moves, like setting up this teleconsultation for mental health, because this is something that was missing in the last budget speech, this acknowledgement of the mental health impacts of the pandemic. But perhaps more could have been done for physical facilities in the health sector, medical education, R&D, if the pandemic has taught us anything, to build more resilience for any future challenges, basically. So the digital push, which is in the budget as a whole, it is in healthcare as well. And this is something that can expand access going forward, including in rural areas where there is an issue of availability of qualified doctors. But again, this is something that's slightly long term. On rural development, Dr. Misra noted as well, it's really nice to see some of these initiatives of optic fiber in villages. Let's hope all of this can be done relatively quickly. On crop diversification, again, not very new, but this it's good to see this push for millets, oil seeds. But I think there's still a blueprint lacking, and ultimately it'll have to come from the demand side, and maybe this is a good application for behavioral interventions or nudges. And the other announcement I liked was about supporting rural startups, like around what the farm and non-farm sectors in rural areas are producing. But then again, not much was said about what kind of support or what the strategy is here. NREGA allocation has been maintained at the B level of FY, down from the RE level. I'm sure we'll talk about this more in the discussion. I think my last point here is that relatively new, this Ministry of Cooperation, which was carved out, like earlier cooperation was managed by, depending on the area of focus, it was just managed by that ministry, like Ministry of Agriculture would be separate, or handloom. So, but I felt like in the budget, there was no major focus on allocating for this ministry so that it can give grants and strengthen the cooperative model, because this kind of thing can really bolster the rural economy, create alternate livelihood options, also for women. There are these successful examples like the Amul model in Gujarat. Though, one thing that was welcome because it needed correction was the tax rate change or relief for the cooperatives to level the playing field. I think I'll stop here.
All right, thank you. An interesting, different perspective from you. So I think without any ado, let's get into discussing some of the points which have come up and we're debating. Saugata, if I can ask you first. Subhomoy said that perhaps we are entering a new paradigm of economic management. So you could perhaps comment on that. But I just was wondering whether, and I think this has been there evident for a year or two, whether this government is consciously has consciously tried to be transparent about numbers. And one or two of the interesting things which did come up, for example, the disinvestment target, which has been revised downwards. I mean, does it, or even the revenue targets, the revenue growth estimates are fairly conservative. So is it just about getting the numbers right, so that, as Subhomoy said, that one favorite pastime of all of us to pick holes and all the fudging and accounting juggling that goes on in the budget. Is it just that, or is it something more than that? In terms of the conservativeness with the numbers at all. What do you think, Saugata?
Shubha, you want to go first or what?
No, Saugata, you go first since he raised the point.
Okay. No. So point number one, I could not agree more with Shubha that the focus has shifted to states. So it's not just the specific areas of responsibility, health, education, agriculture, etc. States, if you see the numbers, have actually spent more on capex than the center for the last 6 or 7 years. So this capex focus that we are talking on in this budget is more states. So one of the good things that we see in this budget is this additional 1 lakh crores allocation to states based on certain conditionalities, some performance-based conditionalities. I think that's that's the way to go, to my mind. So from a central perspective, there are two things that were started during the pandemic, which I think needs to be broadened, taken forward. One is the use of more contingent spending, that is to say insurance. A template for that is the ECLGS, the CGF, CGP, MSC, those kinds of programs, which is intended not just for direct spending on those sectors, but to try to bring in credit to some of these segments. That's one. So this needs to be expanded and more contingent liabilities rather than actual overall debt coming into the system. The second is what Shubha pointed out, that there needs to be more conditionalities driven allocation to states over and above the 42% or whatever. I mean, in terms of the devolvable pool that goes to the states from the central budget. This is to force states and allocation to states with certain behavior. Of course, I mean, there are hazard problems with this. I mean, how do you How do you decide on the metrics, etc.? But that's something which needs attention. From the center's point of view, one of the key things, I'm not getting into the mind-numbing numbers on what, etc. So the couple of things, if you see the receipts, not just tax, receipts as a percentage of GDP, it's been absolutely flat. I mean, there's no, I mean, it bounces around a little bit, and that constrains spending from the center. So that's one thing. The other part from the expenditure side, other than that 42% that needs to be devolved to states, which often doesn't happen, sometimes does, sometimes doesn't. About 35%, 32, 33, 35% is completely committed expenditures, which is interest payments, salaries, pensions, defense spending, etc. That's part of that's gone. Together with this, there is this quasi-committed expenditures, all the subsidies, subvention programs, etc. So the actual amount that the center has to use its fiscal levers to try to get funding into some selected segments, that space is coming down actually. So I mean, these are some of the constraining factors. One last point that Shubho mentioned, and you also touched upon. I think the scale of the borrowing program makes it difficult. Remember that we are going into a very tight recovery. So I mean, it's unequal. The spending power is concentrated in a couple of deciles at the top. So in this environment, you need to make sure, and particularly with the nascent private sector capex recovery, you need to make sure that interest rates do not rise unwarrantedly. They will rise, obviously. I mean, we are in a normalization phase, but not unwarrantedly, as we have seen in the sovereign yield curve. I mean, yesterday itself, sovereign yields 10-year benchmark securities rose about 14, 18 basis points. Yeah, even today, I mean, it's continued rising. And that will inevitably have an impact on the corporate bond markets and through the cost of funds for banks, the bank lending rates, etc., which needs to be looked at more moderately. So you need to diversify the pool of investors. The biggest diversification that we had been hearing about is this the inclusion in the global bond indices, because otherwise, remember, last year in this the 16.6 lakh crores worth of the fiscal deficit and the 15 lakh crores worth of gross borrowings from the center. The Reserve Bank last year came in with 2.4 lakhs through OMOs, GSAPs, and some of the others supporting this yield program, which it can't do this year. Banks will be not very keen. I mean, because credit growth is increasing, so the space that it has to stock up on SLR securities, that's limited. Mutual funds typically do not buy securities when interest rates are on the way up. So, I mean, you need to find an additional marginal pool of investors to keep interest rates from rising unwarranted. People are talking about the 10-year G6 in this year at 7.5%. Imagine the increase that will go. So there are multiple such things. The point is, we've heard from the finance secretary, revenue secretary yesterday on the various bottlenecks in terms of BEPS and some of these other issues which still need to be resolved. In terms of inclusion in bond indexes, the Euroclear thing that we hear about, it's not a necessity. I mean, Malaysia, Thailand, etc., are not members of Euroclear. We need to get our tax structures right, relatively flat structures and capital gains, coupon tax, etc. So those need to be sorted out. But we do need, at this point in time, some additional investors to prevent rates from going up too much. There are multiple other issues, but I'll stop.
One of the other points which have come up in the discussion here as well as outside is on this rising inequality K-shape of recovery. Just wondered if any of you had any comments on whether the budget has done anything or anywhere near enough, or whether it really could not do much more given the circumstances. I mean, given that everyone is saying this is a concern, how has the government, in your view, addressed it, or how should they have addressed it? Dr. Misra, Subhomoy, would any of you like to give your thoughts on? I mean, I know you said about the hospitality sector, but it's about more than just the hospitality sector.
Yeah, I completely agree. The inequality levels have widened during the pandemic. And yeah, my perspective is that while the government is looking at a medium to a long term, but the moment jobs start getting generated, and that is why implementation and execution is key over here. The moment jobs start getting generated, construction will take off, right? With construction sector taking off, it's going to go back and employ more people, and that is where probably that income inequality is going to come down. That is one point that I wanted to make. Second thing, what Subhomoy pointed out was very correct. States need to play an active role. And in my way forward, one of the points that I certainly have is cooperative federalism is the need. Center and states need to work together. It's only then this entire budget can go through, the execution can happen. While the budget has allocated money, but it's the states which have to step in and help in the entire implementation of Gati Shakti, infrastructure building, etc. And that's where I'll stop.
Subhomoy, any thoughts on the inequality part, whether there could have been more in terms of, say, an income transfer or, taxation on wealth? There were various things going around, but do you think that in the end, they did the right thing by not doing any of that?
I usually have a contra view, and I don't think that the central government, other than, some people seem to think that India was printing dollars, and therefore it can give out money the way the developed countries can in terms of income support. They were resolutely, the commentary was again resolutely refusing to add up the food support that was going along. So I think that therefore definitely misses the issue about how much has the center been helping out on that. But my point again is that we are asking the right questions, not this panel. Overall, we are asking the right questions, but to the wrong entity. Again, the center is not the person or the entity which will be doing these things. Migration, for instance.
No, but Subhomoy, just to interrupt you, surely in terms of inequality, it's the direct tax system which has a role to play. So you can't say that, inequality is also something that only state. I can understand, yes, certain aspects like education, health are state domain, but in terms of, the taxation system or transfer system, center still has the lion's share of resources, doesn't it? I'm just trying to provoke you into.
True. Let me say this thing. The total tax to GDP ratio is 10.2%. It's just gone up to 10.7 in this budget. The overall taxes need to go up. Now, how much support is there within the population to accept that the overall taxes need to go up? You can't just impose a wealth tax and expect it to go up to 16%. We are talking about a comparable level of the GDP. If we want to have any dent in the resources that is needed, then the taxes need to go up from 10 to 16%. Would a wealth tax just do it? So essentially, then we need to accept that overall the taxes need to go up. I'm in fact rather of the opinion that the GST rates need to come down. For instance, 28% tax on cement. Cement is used by every household. What sort of a help does it do by keeping cement at 28%? 65% of the cement consumption is at the personal level. So it actually creates more trouble. So the state taxes issue is something that I'm not very sure that it can call for, a plain vanilla thing that, raise taxes at the progressive level at the topmost. It'll actually create more problems than we have been able to solve. Frankly speaking, our tax collection machinery, just like anything else, is of an underdeveloped country. It's becoming better, which is one of the reasons why GST collections have risen. And the reason why, of course, there's the IGST part, which has been captured, the tax on imports, which is why it has risen sharply. But still, the very fact that there's more data now being fed into the tax system means that the taxes will rise. And I would like to let it be there in terms of data being used to allow more taxes to be collected. I think that is the way to go, rather than playing around with rates. I don't think we'll actually be anywhere in terms of giving a substantial boost up in taxes with the rates.
Right.
Now, the reason I'm again saying this is, I was listening very carefully to what Dr. Gulati was talking about, the gender issues. The gender issues are extremely important. But again, I'm not very sure whether the central allocations do much for gender. Let me put in one example. I stay in East Delhi, where it's a poorest part of Delhi. Large number of women go to work and come back in the evenings. One of the reasons that holds back women from working is the absence of street level lighting. Bad lighting from metro stations to their homes. Who fixes that? Does the center fix it? Or does the municipal government fix it? But I see no accountability among us in terms of demanding answers from the municipality, the way that we demand from the center. But those lights can actually do far more, consistently lighting up every day to ensure that women reach the workplace, reach back from the workplace safer. These are the sort of stuff, the interventional stuff, which needs to be actually thought through. Our demands from the government is right. But I think we are, as I said, we are demanding too little from where the demands should be made. That is my prime concern, and that is, I think, is something that I'm pushing along. On the center's issues, because we are often accused, and Dhiraj would know, we are often accused of talking only of macro and fiscal deficit. Dr. Misra would also know, and people are saying that this doesn't have, these are like 36,000 feet. You're not looking down at the ground level thing. Well, when I look at the ground level thing, I realize that the points that need to be asked doesn't get asked to the right agencies. I just gave you the example of the street. I was doing a study on gender issues with my class at Jindal University, and I was asking them that what are the issues that can be handled to make women work more. And they also unfortunately talked about fiscal deficit. So I realized that the problem is very heavy. Yeah, Dhiraj.
Thanks. No, I think interesting point, but just again, since you're talking about the budget, and Nalini, maybe you can comment on this. The proverbial, it's been going on for as long as I remember, Bijli Sadak Pani in our politics, right? And I think if you look at the allocations, this government seems to be taking Sadak and Pani very seriously. You mentioned the road allocation going up a lot, but the other thing which has gone up a lot last year and this year is the allocation for the Jal Jeevan scheme. Do you think that, this government again has a history of, focusing on better delivery of services, not only public services, but even provision of private, what would be traditionally viewed as private goods. And, now water, after the first term, they did gas cylinders and, they've done housing. Now they are doing water. How significant do you think this is? And you can also comment on, whether the entire gender budgeting piece and inequality. How important is it in your view in terms of this inequality debate that we're discussing?
Yeah, so we spoke about Jal Jeevan and similarly Ujjwala, as you mentioned. I think that's been quite important as well in recent years, and there's been a lot of focus and allocation for that. But I think the evidence shows one issue there is, even though all these LPG connections have been given out, the usage is still low. But having said that, all these things do benefit women. I think anything that eases the burden of unpaid care work is welcome. But so just the counterpart on the urban side, we see Swachh Bharat Mission is a big focus of this government, but then are we doing relatively less on the urban side, in terms of public toilets for women? It is because of these things, and, things like safety, which can, as Mr. Subhomoy said, they could be really simple interventions, but they make a difference. And we know women's safety is a big issue in India. Whether or not we're talking about labor force participation, this needs to be fixed. So yes, I think maybe that lies with the local government, but maybe the budget, since we're talking about that, I think it just lays out the priorities of the government and the intent. And in that, in most years, you find that explicit focus missing of acknowledging that there is a problem with our female labor force participation and what can we do about it. Sometimes we say things like, this is about norms, so there's nothing the budget can do about it as such. But then knowing that safety is also a big concern, looking at the gender budget statement, it's really sad to see that a lot of the funds, such as under Nirbhaya. So again, this is something that makes good announcements in earlier years, and it makes for good headlines. But then if you follow it to revised estimates and actual estimates, it's not being spent. So even when the resources are there, I think enough has not been done. This time as well, especially through this pandemic year, domestic violence or this shadow pandemic became a big issue, but then you don't see the focus shifting to one-stop centers and things like that. But here again, I suspect it is something to do with it being clubbed and called something else. So it definitely needs like a closer read.
Sure. Thanks a lot. Saugata, I can't close the discussion without putting you in somewhat of a spot. After I think many budgets, this time there was not a significant amount of time. In fact, I don't know if there was any time spent talking about NPAs and banks and that part of the thing, which has been a big worry. Are we over the worst of the NPA crisis, and do you think the banking system is now getting back in shape to lend and drive the economy?
Yes. So again, obviously, so some of the basic, so the large assumptions of announcements of last year's budget, this was missing this year. So this was a more workman-like budget, asset monetization pipeline, there's that, the bad bank, NARCL, all of that is missing. Credit is very, very important. We are just about seeing signs of corporate credit demand coming back into the banking system. So one part is because of the bond markets, the rates are going up, so the diversion of credit back. This is Dr. Arvind Subramanian's famous twin balance sheet problem. Actually, in India, at one point in time, we had 3, 4, 5, 6 balance sheet problems across the board. So the balance sheet problem is much better. The banks are much better capitalized. The coverage ratios, the provision coverage ratio is much higher. Risk management systems are much better. So banks are their balance sheet, and particularly with the last vestiges of the big ticket items remaining, which are not there in the IBC pipeline. If the NARCL comes in, and we are hearing about the first tranche of 50,000 crores going into the NARCL bank, the bad bank. So that is better. From the other balance sheet, which is the corporate balance sheets, they have deleveraged. That's one of the reasons why credit has not grown in the last couple of years. So they have taken the ample cheap money that the Federal Reserve and the RBI has given into the system. So that's better. That's coming back. So now I think the ability to lend, I think, is increasing. It is in this context, again, I cannot begin to emphasize how important this MSME segment has become. So this is, other corporate capex will happen, but it is this core MSME segment which needs funding. So there are some encouraging signs. I think, given the use of technology that is coming into the system, NBFCs, which have much better last mile access to the MSME sector. Obviously, the fintechs are a small part, but they are beginning to use innovative approaches. So it is this MSME segment which is likely to drive not just economic activity, but also consumption, which at that point in time, in addition to the central and state capex spending, other spending, is likely to create aggregate demand and capacity. And that increasing in capacity utilization will then feed upwards into the large corporates, mid corporates, etc. So, to cut a long story short, your basic question, that I think conditions are now ripe for more credit come into the system, quite apart from the constrained abilities of the governments, given their resource constraints, to spend directly into the system, but with other various other contingent guarantees, backstops, etc., for the banking system as a whole. Balance sheets of banks and balance sheets of corporates are much better and presage an upswing into the capex cycle. The ESG space, climate change, decarbonization, renewables, that will, to my mind, be the next phase of the upswing in the capex.
That's great. I think on a forward-looking note, I think Subhomoy, you wanted to say something?
Just one thing: land, labor, and capital. Of that, as Saugata has rightly pointed out, the capital repair is happening. Land has obviously gone into cold storage. Labor, the laws have been framed, the code it's time that the labor reforms are looked at carefully. It's the center's issued the draft rules, and I think a bit this is something that doesn't cost money, but it costs political will. And I think the center is responsible, and it can't avoid the responsibility of nudging the states. I've been saying that the states, but this time I'll take the other way and say that it's the center which actually has to push the labor reforms and nudge the states to say that come along, get your draft rules into place, and get the labor changes happening. If we are talking about large scale manufacturing, there's no go but to handle that challenge. It has to be tackled head on. Yeah.
Great. I think we can now move to the closing comments from each of you for a couple of minutes each. And while you're doing so, I mean, some of the budget had certain futuristic elements. Saugata already mentioned, the green economy, climate change, that part. There was a lot of emphasis on digitization, drones. I think you did mention it, Pooja, in your presentation. So just a couple of minutes, moving on from here, what you see or what are the areas you see, the 2-3 key areas where, focus can be given by the government, before the next election cycle, general election cycle. So Pooja, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So just to take on from where Subhomoy said, labor reforms, those need to be implemented. The discussion is happening that hopefully in the next financial year that will take place. Land acquisition, land reforms, again, that's another important one that needs to be looked into. While the government did try it in their last stint, but they backed off on it, right? And another 2 set of reforms that I'm looking at, importantly, is going to be administrative reforms and cooperative federalism. Right? If cooperative federalism does not happen, the entire budget scenario that they've brought in front of us, it's going to be difficult for implementing that. Another one that I want to talk about, while it is not in the purview of the budget, but GST Council needs to go back and work quickly on it. Our GST slabs are 4-5, right? We need to bring that down. We need to bring that down. One, bring about a little more transparency in it, and importantly, move forward and get fuel under GST. And the discussion has been happening. So the moment we get fuel under GST, it's going to bring down the cost of production for private, public, everywhere across. That's pretty much what I wanted to talk about.
Thank you, Nalini. You're on mute.
So yeah, overall, I think it's great that they've kind of presented this long-term strategy or vision. They've been confident enough to do that. It's not that populist. So this is a very optimistic outlook that's been presented. Maybe that's not a bad thing. If you think about the pre-pandemic times, I think each year we do our planning, hoping the monsoon will be good. If it's not, I mean, we deal with that in the revised estimate stage and things like that. So maybe these assumptions will hold, that there'll be no lingering effects of the pandemic and economic recovery will be quick. The conditions will be conducive for things like job creation. If that happens, I think we'll be okay. But if not, I think the whole issue of inequalities and unemployment, I think that'll become glaring and something would need to be done about that. I think, as has been covered earlier in the discussion, sounds obvious, but then I think implementation really is key. How fast we are able to, all these big plans and announcements, how fast we are able to get this on the ground and translate it into livelihoods.
Right. Thanks. Saugata, any closing comments?
Nothing very much. I mean, everybody's talked about the critical issues. I mean, obviously, I mean, our jobs, employment, inequality is absolutely center and of discussions, because I mean this at some point in time will hinder sustainable growth. So, and to my mind, again, I mean, I seem like a stuck record. To my mind, it is that MSME segment which is the key. I mean, so and how you deal with this, what the role of the budget in all of this is difficult to.
But Saugata, just one quick, I wanted to just comment also, since you mentioned new sector like the climate change and green economy, and so in terms of the job creation and addressing certain old inequalities and so on, do you think any of these new sectors, whether it's digitization or or green economy, are they going to be the real job creators, or you don't think so?
No, unfortunately, it is this new economy that is creating the jobs problem. So we are becoming much more efficient in terms of what we are doing, but it is this which is creating low-level quality jobs. So it's not just the green economy. The green economy is good because nobody can dispute with that. Given the problems that we are increasingly seeing with climate change, that the green economy will need to be focused on, and inevitably, the amount of funds that we are looking for. Our savings rate will not be able to support the kind of investments that we need. We need global investments coming in, and global investors are very clear that they're not going to invest in anything other than green technology. So this is a very important part. This is a very desirable part. There's no doubt about that. But that in itself will probably not solve the problem. Remember, this is humongous problem of labor outflow from agriculture. That needs to be absorbed. What is going to absorb this pool of the surplus labor is what Shubho mentioned in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of the other segments that are coming in. Imagine, given the state of healthcare, secondary and tertiary with some minimal training of healthcare workers coming into the rural areas, the tier 4, tier 5, tier 6 towns and rural areas. That is what we need to focus on in terms of job growth and recovery.
Great, thank you, Saugata. Subhomoy, the last word from the panel from you. You're on mute. Just unmute yourself.
Except again to say that it's great. Thanks to everyone for having given a chance, and wonderful to have listened. And I fully take on board Saugata's point that the new economy isn't the best news for employment. So we need to think it a bit more carefully. This is way beyond budget, but that's something coming up. Maybe one of the things that is just something that this budget to set a template for how addressing government finances, lots of interesting ways, keeping it short, keeping the focus clear, and doing a targeted budget speech. Maybe that sort of thing, if it becomes a template, could be useful. It's a digestible chunk. But on employment, frankly, I don't think anybody has, a very clear idea on where it will go. I'm one of the slight pessimists on that. Yeah.
Right. This leaves me to sum up. It's given the magnitude of the challenges facing the economy, as you said, we don't yet know on jobs, inequality, where things are going to go. Quite possibly, inequality already is worse. On jobs also, quite possibly, we may have a situation where certain sectors employ less people. Then, of course, Saugata, you said at the start as well, the global macro scenario is also going to get more and more challenging. So I think the challenges are quite a few. But again, I think I would say that one budget can't possibly address every single challenge. But what I again will say is what I liked about it is that it did signal a kind of new template. And I think personally, the government, and this is a theme which we haven't discussed today, but personally, I think the government should do less over the medium term and not more. So I would be quite happy to see less announcements, less schemes, less programs, and more focus on facilitating the sectors which will create jobs, which are outside the government, not in the government as such. And quite rightly, as the panelists said, a lot of the action in terms of some of the social sectors really lies with the states. So maybe I would suggest to Dr. Arjun Kumar of IMPRI that next time around, or maybe sometime later, we should also have a couple of discussions and get Subhomoy on board, discuss state budgets, at least of a couple of important states, because in Delhi, quite frankly, we don't really discuss state budgets, either in the press or in webinars like this. And if the action is indeed moving there, then I think if not all 9 states, at least 4 or 5 states, we should start talking about those as well, and then see what the center is doing, what the state is doing, what local level needs to do, and at least implementation, again, as you said, is mostly local or local government or state government, not center. So I think, again, just to reiterate, I think the budget was what budget should increasingly look like, in my view, kind of dull, transparent in their numbers so that we don't have to go digging out where the holes are, how the maths adds up. So I think in that sense, the overall template is nice, and the clear focus on growth is nice. The resistance to populism is nice. So I think stick to a lot of boxes. Obviously, everybody wants more, but nobody wants to pay more taxes. And as Subhomoy said, where's the money going to come from to spend on every priority or everything that we want? So thank you all. Thank you so much for joining, Dr. Arjun Kumar. Thank you all. Thank you so much for having all of us here.
Thank you so much, sir. Such an enriching deliberation, and of course we'll see that we have deliberation on state budgets also. Many of the state government people are also very excited because they are also in process of economic survey and all. So it will be worthwhile. We'll try also to do that. So I would really like to thank all of our panelists and to give a short vote of thanks. Now I invite Anshula.
Thank you, everyone. As we come to the end of this very insightful and enriching deliberation on the pandemic era and Union Budget 2022-23, I, Anshula Mehta, Senior Assistant Director at IMPRI, would like to formally propose a vote of thanks. On behalf of the IMPRI Center for the Study of Finance and Economics, I thank our distinguished panel for being with us today. We are grateful to Dr. Dhiraj Nayyar for chairing the discussion and driving it with his valuable inputs and interventions. Thank you, sir. We thank our panelists, Nalini Gulati, Mr. Saugata Bhattacharya, Dr. Pooja Misra, and Subhomoy Bhattacharjee for being with us and for sharing their valuable insights and analysis of the Union Budget 2022. And of course, we are grateful to all our participants who joined us here on Zoom as well as on Facebook Live, or would be watching us later on YouTube or listening to us on our podcast. We hope that you continue to tune in to future episodes of Towards Accountability, as well as our other discussions on the Budget 2022 that we have lined up in the coming days, as well as, of course, all our other web policy talks. Thank you again, and I wish you all a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes,